Hey guys, tonight we begin with dusty roads, exhausted pilgrims, suspicious monks, and a group of medieval men who somehow looked at the chaos of the Crusades and thought, yes, this seems like a reasonable career path. So dim the lights a little. Maybe put your phone face down somewhere nearby. Get comfortable. And together, we'll drift slowly into the strange, sleepy, occasionally ridiculous world of the Knights Templar. A world filled with holy wars, awkward vows of poverty, suspicious amounts of gold, dramatic royal meltdowns, and medieval public relations campaigns so effective that people are still making conspiracy theories about them 900 years later. Which honestly is impressive branding. Now, when most people hear Knights Templar, they imagine secret treasure vaults, mysterious symbols, hidden knowledge, or perhaps Nicolas Cage aggressively stealing historical documents. But the real story is much stranger and much sadder. Because the Templars did not begin as rich masterminds controlling Europe from shadowy underground chambers. They began as a handful of deeply tired men in worn-out cloaks trying to stop pilgrims from being robbed on dangerous roads near Jerusalem, which sounds significantly less cinematic. But in medieval Europe, it was considered revolutionary. So, let's float back to the early 1100s, a time when Europe was full of castles, chronic illnesses, questionable hygiene, and nobles named things like Baldwin, Geoffrey, and Fulk. Especially Fulk. There were always several Fulks wandering around medieval Europe causing administrative problems. Now, a few years earlier, the First Crusade had ended with European Christian armies capturing Jerusalem in 1099. This shocked almost everyone, including many of the people who participated in it. Because frankly, the Crusades were not organized with what we might call modern efficiency. These armies marched thousands of miles with limited supplies, poor communication, and emotional stability hanging by a thread. Some Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land starving. Others arrived diseased. Some arrived deeply confused about geography. And yet somehow, against enormous odds, Jerusalem fell. This created a brand new Crusader kingdom in the Middle East. European nobles suddenly found themselves ruling hot, unfamiliar territories they barely understood. It was like handing a damp Norman knight a map of the Levant and saying, "Congratulations, you now manage several cities full of people who dislike you. Good luck with that." Now for Christian pilgrims in Europe, Jerusalem became the ultimate destination. Thousands of people wanted to travel there. Rich pilgrims, poor pilgrims, elderly pilgrims, pilgrims who absolutely should not have attempted a journey of several thousand miles on foot. But they went anyway, because medieval Christianity took pilgrimage very seriously. The problem was that the roads to Jerusalem were incredibly dangerous. Pilgrims were routinely robbed, kidnapped, or killed along isolated routes. Bandits saw them as easy targets, which, to be fair, they often were. Imagine walking across hostile territory, carrying religious relics, jewelry, and travel money while dressed like an exhausted potato sack. You were practically announcing yourself as loot. So around 1119, a small French knight named Hugh de Payens decided something needed to be done. Hugh was not especially glamorous. He was not a famous conqueror. He was not a brilliant king. He was simply a lower-ranking nobleman from Champagne with determination and, apparently, a very high tolerance for dust. He gathered a tiny group of knights, traditionally 9 men, and proposed an unusual idea. What if knights became monks? Now, this may not sound shocking today, but at the time, this combination felt deeply strange. Monks were supposed to pray, fast, and avoid violence. Knights were supposed to stab people on horseback. Combining the two professions sounded spiritually confusing. It was like inventing a vegan butcher. But Hugh and his companions believed they could create a holy brotherhood devoted to protecting pilgrims. They would live under religious vows while also functioning as armed warriors. The King of Jerusalem, Baldwin II of Jerusalem, allowed them to stay in part of the former Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. Crusaders believed this area stood near the ancient Temple of Solomon, so the group became known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, which is a very medieval title. And naturally, everyone shortened it to the Knights Templar because nobody has time for all that. Now, the poor part was initially very real. Early Templars genuinely lacked money. Their famous seal supposedly showed 2 knights riding 1 horse, symbolizing poverty and shared resources. Although historians still debate whether this was symbolic humility or simply evidence that medieval startup funding was difficult. Probably both. The Templars took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They wore simple white mantles. They lived communally. They ate modest meals, at least in theory. As with many medieval institutions, things became more complicated once money started arriving. And money arrived very quickly, because the Templars had accidentally created one of the most appealing brands in medieval Christianity. Think about it. They were warrior monks defending pilgrims in Jerusalem. They looked disciplined. They sounded holy. They lived beside one of Christianity's most sacred locations. European nobles absolutely loved this. Donations poured in from across Christendom. Land, castles, farms, horses, silver. Some nobles donated because they genuinely admired the Templars. Others donated because medieval people were deeply anxious about salvation and hoped generous gifts might improve their chances with God. A surprisingly relatable form of panic, honestly. Now, one man who became extremely important to the Templars was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was one of the most influential church figures in Europe. Thin, intense, deeply charismatic, and permanently exhausted-looking in most artwork. He was the kind of medieval monk who fasted so aggressively that even other monks thought he needed a sandwich. Bernard loved the Templars. He believed Christian knighthood needed reform. Too many knights were violent, arrogant, and interested mainly in tournaments, drinking, and personal glory. So Bernard promoted the idea of the Holy Knight, a warrior who fought not for greed, but for God. In one of his writings, he basically argued that killing in the service of Christ was spiritually acceptable for the Templars, which solved a major theological problem for them, because medieval Christianity traditionally frowned upon murder, a difficult obstacle for professional cavalry units. Bernard's support transformed the Templars from an obscure group into an officially respected institution. In 1129, The Church formally recognized the order at the Council of Troyes, and suddenly the Templars exploded in popularity. New recruits arrived constantly. Templar houses appeared across Europe. They became an international organization with property stretching from England to the Holy Land. And here is where things start becoming quietly fascinating. Because while most people imagine the Templars purely as warriors, they were also administrators, bankers, diplomats, landlords, and logistical experts. Which sounds less exciting than sword fights. But medieval logistics were astonishingly important. A knight in the Holy Land needed food, horses, armor, replacement, equipment, servants, money transfers, and communication networks. The Templars built systems for all of this. They became incredibly organized. Suspiciously organized, honestly. Especially compared to everyone else in the 12th century, who were often managing entire kingdoms with the administrative precision of a distracted goat. Now, one reason the Templars gained enormous trust was their reputation for discipline. Unlike many secular knights, Templars followed strict rules. They prayed at set hours. They shared property communally. They obeyed superiors. They were forbidden from fleeing battle unless massively outnumbered, which sounds noble, but also deeply stressful. Imagine being a nervous young Templar recruit hearing that retreat was forbidden unless 3 enemy horses surrounded you, or some equally specific medieval clause. Meanwhile, the enemy is charging toward you holding curved swords and shouting in languages you do not understand. Very calming atmosphere. Templar life was rigid. Meals were controlled. Clothing was regulated. Conversation was monitored. Punishments existed for everything from cowardice to excessively fancy belts. Because medieval religious orders were extremely concerned about belts for reasons modern historians are still emotionally processing. The white mantle became their symbol of purity. Later, they added the famous Red Cross. And soon the Templars gained an almost mythical reputation among Christians. Stories spread of fearless charges into impossible battles. Some of these stories were exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers loved exaggeration. A battle involving 40 knights would eventually become a tale about 12 heroic men defeating 17,000 enemies while glowing with divine light. History writing was more flexible back then, but the Templars genuinely were respected fighters. And they needed to be, because the Crusader states were constantly unstable. Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa were surrounded by powerful Muslim rulers who understandably disliked foreign Christian kingdoms occupying the region. So the Templars became permanent military defenders of these fragile states. They built massive fortresses across the Middle East. And these castles were extraordinary. Thick walls, huge towers, sophisticated defenses. Some looked less like monasteries and more like someone had challenged a mountain to become aggressive architecture. One famous Templar fortress was saved. Another was Chateau Pellerin near the Mediterranean coast. These strongholds projected power, stability, and permanence. Although permanence, as medieval history repeatedly demonstrates, is usually temporary, wearing confident clothing. Now, despite their fame, the Templars were not universally loved. Many local people disliked them. Some Crusader nobles resented their independence. And occasionally the Templars themselves behaved with astonishing arrogance. Because once an organization becomes wealthy and powerful, humility often begins quietly packing its bags. The Templars answered directly to the Pope. This gave them enormous freedom. They could cross borders, avoid taxes, operate independently of kings, which sounded spiritually efficient. But politically, it made rulers extremely nervous. Imagine a multinational military banking organization inside your kingdom that obeys a foreign religious authority instead of you. Kings tended to look at that arrangement and develop immediate headaches. Still, during the 12th century, the Templars flourished. They escorted pilgrims, protected castles, managed estates, transferred money internationally. And yes, this is the part where they slowly wandered into medieval banking. Because of course they did. A pilgrim traveling from France to Jerusalem faced a serious problem. Carrying large amounts of cash across thousands of miles was dangerous. Bandits loved cash, probably even more than belts. So the Templars developed systems allowing pilgrims to deposit money in Europe and withdraw funds later in the Holy Land using written documents, which was remarkably advanced. Essentially, they helped create early international banking networks. Not modern banking exactly. Nobody was applying for medieval mortgages online. But still, for the 12th century, this was sophisticated stuff. And it made the Templars even richer. Now, naturally, wealth brought complications. The order that had begun with vows of poverty now controlled enormous resources. Templar houses managed farmland, vineyards, mills, ports, and treasure. Some members still lived austerely. Others enjoyed considerably more comfort than the founders probably imagined. This happens constantly in history. A movement begins with simple ideals. Then several decades later someone is managing 12 estates while arguing about imported wine. Human nature remains impressively consistent. And quietly, beneath all this growth, so settle back in again. Adjust the blanket slightly. Maybe imagine a cool evening breeze drifting through a stone castle window somewhere far away from medieval sanitation. Last time, we left the Knights Templar growing richer, more powerful, and considerably more confident than the 9 dusty knights who first arrived in Jerusalem. They now owned castles, farmland, shipping networks, and enough donated property to make several European nobles quietly jealous, which was becoming a problem, because the Templars still claimed to be humble warrior monks devoted to poverty. Meanwhile, they were operating massive financial systems across Europe and the Middle East. A very medieval version of saying, "We're just simple servants of God," while standing inside a fortress full of gold. And unfortunately for them, the political situation around Jerusalem was becoming increasingly unstable. The Crusader states had survived for decades, but survival is not the same thing as stability. These kingdoms were always fragile. They depended on military victories, alliances, trade, luck, and the constant arrival of new European crusaders who generally arrived underprepared and overdressed for the climate. The heat alone must have been devastating for Northern Europeans. Imagine being a heavily armored French knight from Normandy suddenly asked to fight in the Levantine summer while wrapped in chain mail. You would become soup almost immediately. And during all this, Muslim rulers across the region were slowly reorganizing. At first, the Crusaders benefited because their opponents were politically divided. Different rulers fought one another as much as they fought the Europeans. But then came Nur ad-Din and later his far more famous successor, Saladin. Now Saladin is one of those historical figures who became admired by both sides. Even many Christian chroniclers respected him, which almost never happens during wars. Usually medieval writers described enemies as demonic swamp creatures sent personally by Satan. But Saladin earned a reputation for intelligence, discipline, and relative mercy. Also, importantly, he was patient, extremely patient. While Crusader leaders argued among themselves like exhausted cousins fighting over inheritance paperwork, Saladin carefully built power across Egypt and Syria. He unified territories, strengthened armies, managed alliances, and waited. Meanwhile, inside the Crusader states, things were becoming deeply chaotic. The Kingdom of Jerusalem suffered from one persistent issue. Its kings kept dying, sometimes from disease, sometimes from stress, sometimes from being medieval people with access to almost no effective medicine. One particularly tragic ruler was Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. Now Baldwin IV is remembered as the Leper King, which already sounds like medieval history trying a little too hard with dramatic titles. But Baldwin was actually intelligent and determined. The problem was that he developed leprosy as a child, and medieval medicine had absolutely no idea what to do about that. Doctors at the time approached illness with a fascinating combination of confidence and complete confusion. Their treatments often involved bloodletting, strange diets, prayer, herbs, or simply staring at the patient with concern while recommending less excitement. Baldwin's condition slowly worsened throughout his life. Yet despite intense physical suffering, he still ruled Jerusalem during one of its most dangerous periods. Honestly, his entire reign feels exhausting. Nobles competed for influence around him constantly. Rival factions formed at court. Marriage alliances became political warfare. And through all this, the Templars remained major players. Because military orders like the Templars and the Knights Hospitaller controlled large armies and huge resources. Kings needed them, but also feared them. A familiar medieval relationship. Now during Baldwin's reign, one particularly irritating man emerged named Reynald of Chatillon. And Reynald was exactly the kind of person who makes delicate diplomacy impossible. He had already spent years imprisoned by Muslim rulers earlier in life, which apparently did not encourage introspection. Instead, he became even more reckless afterward. Reynald attacked caravans during peace treaties, provoked Muslim powers unnecessarily, and once allegedly threatened Muslim holy cities near Mecca, which was an astonishingly dangerous idea. This would be like poking a sleeping lion with a stick while also insulting the lion's family. Even many Crusaders thought Reynald was unstable. But medieval politics being medieval politics, he still retained influence. Now Saladin watched all of this carefully, and eventually, after repeated provocations, he prepared for large-scale war against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This brings us to one of the most important moments in Templar history, the Battle of Hattin in 1187. And honestly, the entire campaign leading up to Hattin feels like a slow-motion disaster everyone could see approaching. Jerusalem's leaders argued about strategy. Some advised caution. Others demanded aggressive action. The Templars, known for militant enthusiasm, generally favored confrontation. Because of course they did. Military monks are not historically famous for saying, "Perhaps we should calmly de-escalate." So the Crusader army marched across brutally hot terrain towards Saladin's forces near the horns of Hattin. And almost immediately things began going terribly. Water became scarce. The summer heat intensified. Saladin's troops harassed the exhausted Crusaders constantly. Smoke from burning grass reportedly drifted across the battlefield. Imagine being dehydrated, sleep-deprived, wearing heavy armor, and surrounded by enemies while your leadership structure collapses in real time. Not ideal conditions for strategic thinking. The Templars fought fiercely during the battle. But fierce fighting does not always solve logistical catastrophe. The Crusader army was crushed. Thousands died or were captured. The true cross, one of Christianity's most sacred relics, was seized. And many Templars were executed afterward. Saladin reportedly viewed the Templars and Hospitallers as especially dangerous because they were permanent holy warriors, not ordinary nobles who could simply negotiate ransoms and return home. This defeat shattered Crusader power in the region. And shortly afterward, Jerusalem itself surrendered to Saladin. Now, interestingly, Saladin did not massacre the city's inhabitants the way some earlier conquerors had done. Instead, many residents were allowed to ransom themselves or leave peacefully. Again, this deeply annoyed medieval propagandists who preferred cleaner good versus evil narratives. Reality kept becoming inconveniently complicated. For Europe, though, the fall of Jerusalem was a spiritual shock. The city Christians had captured less than a century earlier was gone. And suddenly the Templars looked less invincible. Still wealthy. Still influential. But vulnerable. Now, naturally, Europe responded the only way medieval Europe ever responded to Crusader disasters. By launching another crusade. The Third Crusade brought several enormous personalities into the story. First, there was Richard I of England. Richard Lionheart is remembered as the ultimate crusading king. Brave, charismatic, dramatic, permanently ready for battle. He was basically medieval Europe's action hero. But also, importantly, he spent remarkably little time actually governing England. Richard treated England less like a kingdom and more like a convenient ATM machine for funding wars abroad. The man loved crusading with astonishing commitment. Administration bored him. Taxes did not. Now Richard respected the Templars greatly. And the Templars admired Richard because he embodied aggressive knightly warfare in its purest form. The crusade itself achieved mixed results. Richard won impressive battles. Saladin remained resilient. Jerusalem was never fully retaken. And eventually everyone grew exhausted enough to negotiate, which happens surprisingly often in history. After years of killing each other, both sides simply become tired and start discussing travel arrangements. Now, during this period, the Templars continued evolving into something larger than a military order. Their banking operations expanded enormously.
Kings borrowed money from them.
Nobles stored valuables with them. Pilgrims trusted them. And because Templar houses existed across Europe, they could move funds internationally with relative security. This made them incredibly useful, but also increasingly suspicious-looking, especially to rulers drowning in debt. And medieval kings were almost always drowning in debt. Wars were expensive. Castles were expensive. Royal courts were expensive. Even maintaining a respectable number of decorative falcons probably cost a fortune. Meanwhile, the Templars kept accumulating property and privileges. They answered only to the Pope. They paid limited taxes. And their internal secrecy created rumors. Now, to be fair, much of this secrecy was normal for medieval religious orders. Private ceremonies were common. Initiation rituals were common. But humans absolutely love inventing strange theories about closed organizations, especially wealthy ones.
So rumors spread.
Some accused the Templars of arrogance. Others accused them of greed. And eventually far stranger accusations appeared. Claims that they worshipped idols, denied Christ secretly, performed bizarre rituals. Most of these stories were probably nonsense fueled by fear, jealousy, and political opportunism. But once rumors begin circulating, they rarely disappear quietly. And the Templars were making themselves very easy targets. Partly because they had become so rich, partly because their original mission was slowly collapsing. The Crusader states continued shrinking during the 13th century. Muslim powers regained territory steadily. Templar castles fell one by one. And despite repeated crusades, European enthusiasm for endless holy war slowly weakened. People still preached crusades constantly, but maintaining permanent Christian kingdoms in the Middle East proved extraordinarily difficult. Distance alone created massive problems. Everything required shipping, coordination, money, and endless manpower. The Templars remained committed long after many others lost hope. They continued defending coastal strongholds and remaining Crusader territories. But the tide had shifted. And then came the fall of Acre in 1291. Acre was the last major Crusader city in the Holy Land. Its final siege was brutal and chaotic. The Templars fought desperately during the defense. Their Grand Master at the time, William of Beaujeu, reportedly died during the battle. And when Acre finally fell, the Crusader dream in the Holy Land essentially ended. The Templars evacuated survivors by sea. Those who remained were killed or captured. After nearly 2 centuries, the Crusader states were gone. And suddenly the Templars faced an uncomfortable question. What exactly was their purpose now? This was a serious issue. Their entire identity centered around protecting the Holy Land. Without Crusader territories, they still possessed wealth, castles, ships, political influence, and banking systems. But their original mission had vanished. And idle, powerful organizations tend to make rulers nervous, especially rulers who owe them enormous sums of money. Which brings us slowly toward one deeply frustrated French king. A king who was cold, calculating, permanently cash-strapped, and increasingly irritated by the Templars' independence. Philip IV of France. A man so emotionally frosty that historians sometimes describe him as if he personally invented administrative anxiety. And unfortunately for the Templars, Philip needed money. A lot of money. Which is where our sleepy story begins, drifting toward arrests, accusations, confessions, and one of the most famous political takedowns in medieval history. Because when kings become desperate enough, even holy warrior monks with centuries of prestige suddenly start looking less sacred and more financially convenient. So once again, settle in gently. Maybe shift the pillow to the colder side. Take a slow breath. And let's drift back into medieval Europe, where kings wore heavy crowns, monks copied books by candlelight, and the Knights Templar were about to discover that accumulating vast wealth while irritating powerful rulers is rarely a sustainable long-term strategy, especially in France. Because France at the beginning of the 14th century was ruled by a man who approached problems with the emotional warmth of an unpaid tax collector. Philip IV of France. Philip was known as Philip the Fair, mostly because he was considered handsome, which medieval chroniclers loved mentioning, as though symmetrical cheekbones somehow improved governance. And to be fair, Philip probably did look impressive. Tall, pale, regal, very controlled. The sort of king who appears in paintings staring at viewers like he already disapproves of their bookkeeping. But behind the elegant appearance was a deeply stubborn ruler obsessed with royal authority. Philip wanted control. Control over nobles. Control over taxes. Control over the church, when possible. And definitely control over money. Unfortunately, money was precisely what he lacked. This happened constantly with medieval monarchs. Kings spent enormous sums on wars, courts, castles, ceremonies, and political disputes. Then eventually they looked around the kingdom searching for someone wealthier than themselves to pressure aggressively. And the Templars were sitting there like an extremely tempting golden piggy bank. Now Philip already had experience bullying powerful groups for financial reasons. He had fought bitterly with the papacy over taxation. He expelled Jewish communities from France and seized assets from many of them. He manipulated currency. He borrowed heavily from Italian bankers. Basically, Philip managed royal finances the way a desperate man rearranges furniture, hoping coins will appear underneath. And throughout all this, he owed substantial debts to the Templars, which must have become increasingly irritating. Imagine borrowing huge sums from an organization that technically answered not to you, but to the Pope. An organization operating massive estates across your kingdom. An organization whose members wore white cloaks, possessed fortified compounds, and maintained international communication networks. At some point, Philip probably looked at the Templars and thought, absolutely not. Now, the Templars themselves were not helping matters. By the early 1300s, they had developed a somewhat aloof reputation. Many ordinary people admired them, certainly, but others saw them as proud, wealthy, and secretive. They conducted private initiation ceremonies. They guarded internal rules carefully. And after losing the Holy Land, they seemed strangely directionless. There were discussions about new Crusades. discussions about merging military orders, discussions about future missions. But mostly the Templars remained enormously rich without a clearly defined military purpose. Historically, this is dangerous. Very dangerous. Because people tolerate powerful organizations more easily when those organizations appear necessary. Once necessity fades, scrutiny arrives wearing very sharp shoes. Now, around this time, rumors against the Templars intensified dramatically. Whispers spread across France claiming that initiation ceremonies involved bizarre rituals. Some alleged new recruits spat on crosses. Others claimed they denied Christ symbolically. There were stories about secret idols, obscene kisses, hidden heresies, and honestly, much of it sounds exactly like what humans always invent about mysterious groups they distrust. The accusations were contradictory, sensational, and often absurd. But absurdity has never prevented rumors from succeeding politically, especially when fear, debt, and royal ambition become involved. Now, one important thing to understand is that medieval Europe took heresy incredibly seriously. This was not viewed as simple religious disagreement. Heresy threatened the spiritual structure of society itself. People genuinely believed incorrect beliefs endangered souls and invited divine punishment. So accusations of heresy carried enormous weight, and Philip knew this very well. Now enter another crucial figure, Clement V. Poor Clement. Honestly, one almost feels bad for him. He became pope during a period of intense political pressure and spent much of his papacy trying unsuccessfully to avoid being crushed between competing powers. Clement was French, which already made many people suspicious of his relationship with Philip. And unlike some earlier popes who battled kings aggressively, Clement was more cautious, more diplomatic, more tired, probably. Medieval popes aged emotionally at incredible speed. Now, initially, Clement did not seem eager to attack the Templars. But Philip was relentless. And then, on Friday, October 13th, 1307, everything changed. The next day, armed officials arrive accusing you of secret devil worship. That is an emotionally difficult morning, especially before coffee. The charges against the Templars were extraordinary. They allegedly denied Christ during initiation, spat on crosses, engaged in obscene rituals, worshipped idols, sometimes described as mysterious heads, participated in immoral acts, and conducted secret ceremonies so strange they sound like medieval panic inventing itself in real time. Now, historians today overwhelmingly believe most of these accusations were false, or distorted fragments of misunderstood rituals, or confessions extracted under torture. Because yes, torture entered the story very quickly. Philip's officials interrogated arrested Templars aggressively, and under torture, many confessed. Humans will confess to astonishing things while being tortured. This is one reason torture is historically terrible at producing reliable information. Pain does not create truth. It creates desperation. But in medieval Europe, confessions carried immense importance. And once confessions began appearing, momentum built rapidly. Some Templars later retracted their admissions. Others maintained them. Some probably became psychologically shattered. The whole situation turned into a catastrophic mixture of fear, coercion, politics, and religious hysteria. Now Jacques de Molay himself initially confessed to some accusations. Later he withdrew parts of those confessions, which made matters even more chaotic. And throughout Europe, rulers watched carefully. Some monarchs seemed skeptical of Philip's campaign. Others cooperated cautiously, because regardless of whether the accusations were believable, nobody wanted to appear soft on heresy. That was politically dangerous. Now, one strange aspect of the Templar trials is how repetitive many accusations became. Investigators seemed almost obsessed with certain details. Secret kisses, denials of Christ, mysterious idols. It feels strangely formulaic, like authorities had developed a template for unacceptable behavior and simply kept inserting details until the story sounded horrifying enough, which, unfortunately, often works, especially during periods of fear. Now Pope Clement attempted to take control of the investigations. Technically, the Templars answered to the papacy, not secular rulers. Philip's aggressive actions therefore created enormous tension. But Clement struggled to resist the French king effectively. Philip applied relentless pressure, political pressure, military pressure, psychological pressure, probably exhausting dinner conversations. Eventually, the Pope authorized broader investigations into the order. And suddenly Europe filled with hearings, interrogations, testimonies, and deeply uncomfortable monks trying to explain themselves to suspicious officials. Interestingly, results varied widely depending on location. In some regions, Templars confessed quickly under harsh treatment. In others, investigations found little evidence against them. Some rulers barely pursued the charges. Others enthusiastically participated. This inconsistency itself suggests the accusations were politically shaped rather than universally obvious. If the Templars had truly been conducting enormous secret satanic ceremonies for centuries, one might expect clearer evidence. Instead, investigators often seem to be constructing narratives out of rumor and pressure. Now, during all this, ordinary people across Europe watched in fascination. The mighty Templars falling from grace must have felt surreal. For generations, they had symbolized holy warfare and elite prestige. Suddenly, they were branded heretics. Humans are endlessly captivated by public downfalls, especially dramatic ones. And medieval Europe absolutely loved spectacle. Trials, executions, confessions, ceremonies, public humiliation. It was essentially the entertainment industry of the period, though significantly grimmer. Now, one especially tragic detail is that many Templars were elderly by this point. These were aging men who had spent decades in religious service. Some had genuinely fought in the Holy Land. Others managed estates quietly for years. And suddenly, they found themselves imprisoned, interrogated, and accused of monstrous crimes. There is something deeply sad about the collapse. Not because the Templars were perfect. They were not. They could be arrogant, militaristic, politically stubborn, and extremely wealthy. But the destruction of the order feels less like justice and more like a calculated political liquidation. a slow administrative execution disguised as moral outrage, which history contains plenty of. Now eventually, under mounting pressure, Pope Clement formally dissolved the Templar order in 1312. Importantly, he did not fully declare them guilty as an institution. That distinction matters. Instead, the order was dissolved by apostolic provision, essentially because controversy and scandal had made its continued existence impossible. A very bureaucratic ending for one of medieval Europe's most legendary organizations. Their assets were theoretically transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though naturally kings and local rulers often kept plenty for themselves. Because medieval asset transfers had a mysterious tendency to leak valuables, especially around royalty. Now, as for Jacques de Molay, his fate became legendary. After years of imprisonment, he and other Templar leaders were publicly condemned in Paris in 1314. But then something unexpected happened. Jacques reportedly retracted his earlier confessions publicly. He declared the order innocent. This was enormously inconvenient for authorities, because public recantation threatened the entire narrative, and Philip did not enjoy inconvenient narratives. So Jacques de Molay was declared a relapsed heretic, which carried a grim punishment. He was burned at the stake on an island in the Seine River. And here history begins blending into legend. According to later stories, Jacques proclaimed curses against Philip and Pope Clement before dying, summoning them to God's judgment within the year. And remarkably, both men did die not long afterward, which medieval people found extremely dramatic. Historians are more cautious about the curse story. It may have been embellished later, but honestly, medieval chroniclers adored ominous final speeches. They treated dying declarations like theatrical finales. Still, the timing certainly helped create mythology, and mythology clung to the Templars permanently afterward. Because once an organization is destroyed suddenly amid secrecy, treasure rumors, torture, and political conspiracy, people begin imagining things. Hidden gold, secret archives, escaped knights, underground survival, mystical knowledge. And over the centuries, the Templars transformed from historical military order into something far stranger in popular imagination. A symbol onto which every generation projected new fantasies. But the reality was quieter, more human, more tragic. The Knights Templar began as idealistic holy warriors protecting pilgrims on dangerous roads. Then they became bankers, landlords, diplomats, generals, and political players. Then finally, they became victims of fear, ambition, debt, and royal power, which, unfortunately, is one of the most common endings in history. And strangely enough, even after their destruction, the Templars never truly disappeared from memory. If anything, they became more famous afterward, because humans rarely remember ordinary institutions forever, but destroy something dramatically enough, and people will whisper about it for centuries. So tonight, let's continue drifting through the long afterlife of the Knights Templar, because in some ways, the strangest part of the Templar story begins after they are gone, which feels unfair, honestly. Imagine dedicating your entire life to a religious military order, surviving desert campaigns, financial administration, awkward monastery meals, and decades of political stress, only for people centuries later to mostly discuss whether you hid magical treasure beneath Scotland. History can be rude like that. Now, after the destruction of the order in the early 1300s, Europe should theoretically have moved on. The Templars were dissolved.
Their leaders were dead.
Their properties had been seized. Their remaining members either joined other orders, retired quietly, or vanished into ordinary life. End of story. Except not really, because the collapse had been so sudden, so dramatic, and so politically suspicious that people struggled to accept it as ordinary history. And humans deeply dislike uncertainty. Whenever records are incomplete or events feel emotionally unresolved, the imagination rushes in enthusiastically carrying candles and nonsense. So almost immediately, rumors began spreading. What happened to the Templar treasure? Did some knights escape? Were secret documents hidden somewhere? Did the order survive underground? And perhaps most importantly, why did everyone suddenly become so weird about mysterious buried objects? Now, to be fair, medieval people loved relics and hidden treasure long before the Templars arrived. Europe was already full of stories about sacred artifacts, lost crowns, hidden saints' bones, forgotten tombs, magical books, and enough splinters of the true cross to theoretically rebuild several forests. But the Templars added something especially powerful to the formula. They had once been wealthy, very wealthy. And when wealthy institutions collapse suddenly, people assume treasure must be hidden somewhere.
It is almost automatic.
If a medieval peasant heard that Europe's richest warrior monks had been arrested overnight, the next logical thought was probably not, "Ah yes, orderly financial confiscation procedures."
No.
The thought was absolutely, "There must be gold buried somewhere under a suspicious chapel." And honestly understandable. Now, one persistent legend claimed that shortly before the arrests in France, Templar ships quietly departed from the port of La Rochelle carrying treasure and important documents away to safety. This story became incredibly influential later, because once ships vanish mysteriously into the Atlantic, the imagination begins doing cardio. Where did they go?
Scotland?
Portugal? Secret islands? Underground vaults? A surprisingly organized cave system staffed by emotionally exhausted monks? Nobody knew, which made the story even more attractive. Now, historically, there is little evidence that gigantic treasure fleets escaped dramatically in the night. The Templars certainly possessed wealth, but much of it existed as land, infrastructure, legal rights, grain stores, banking records, and property. Not mountains of gold coins piled theatrically in underground chambers beside glowing torches. Real wealth is usually more administrative and disappointing. Still, some movable valuables likely disappeared during the chaos. And small mysteries have a remarkable tendency to become enormous legends over time, especially once writers, mystics, treasure hunters, and conspiracy enthusiasts get involved centuries later. Now Scotland became deeply connected to Templar mythology for several reasons. First, Scotland was politically complicated during the Templar arrests. Robert the Bruce had recently been excommunicated during his struggle against England, which meant papal authority there operated somewhat awkwardly. Some later legends claimed fleeing Templars found refuge in Scotland and fought alongside Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn. This sounds wonderfully cinematic. Mysterious warrior monks emerging from the mist to rescue Scotland at a critical moment. Unfortunately, hard evidence is extremely limited. But lack of evidence has never harmed a good legend. If anything, it tends to improve one. Now, eventually these stories attach themselves to places like Rosslyn Chapel. And Rosslyn Chapel is almost unfairly perfect for conspiracy theories. It is beautiful, mysterious-looking, filled with elaborate carvings, and already feels like the sort of place where someone would whisper cryptic warnings beside candlelight. The chapel was built in the 15th century, long after the Templars officially disappeared. But later writers linked it heavily with supposed hidden Templar secrets. Some claimed treasure was buried beneath it. Others insisted the Holy Grail was hidden there. Others looked at decorative carvings and concluded they revealed ancient mysteries. Historians generally respond to these claims with exhausted patience, because medieval becomes oddly practical. Instead of completely destroying the Templars, the Portuguese crown essentially reorganized many former Templars into a new group called the Order of Christ, which is one of the most medieval administrative solutions imaginable. We have concerns about your controversial military order, so we shall rename it slightly. Very efficient. This allowed Portugal to retain experienced knights, properties, and resources while avoiding some of the political baggage attached to the Templar name. And interestingly, the Order of Christ later became associated with Portuguese exploration during the Age of Discovery. Its cross even appeared on the sails of some Portuguese ships. So, in a strange way, traces of the Templars drifted outward into the Atlantic world, which feels poetically appropriate. Now, meanwhile, in popular imagination, the Templars gradually transformed into something far beyond ordinary history. By the Renaissance and later centuries, writers began portraying them as guardians of ancient wisdom, secret keepers, mystics, hidden philosophers. This often said more about the fantasies of later generations than about the real medieval Templars themselves, because the actual Templars were mostly practical men. They managed farms, collected rents, maintained horses, filed records, complained about supplies, and occasionally charged into catastrophic battles. Not exactly the daily schedule of mystical sorcerers, but ordinary administration rarely survives in public memory. Mystery does. Now, during the 18th and 19th centuries, various secret societies became fascinated with the Templars, especially groups interested in symbolism, ritual, and imagined ancient lineages. Some Masonic traditions adopted Templar imagery or claimed symbolic connections. And suddenly the Templars entered a completely new phase of cultural life. No longer just medieval monks. Now, they were esoteric icons, which the original Templars probably would have found deeply confusing. Imagine a 12th century Templar knight learning that centuries later people in tailored suits would perform symbolic rituals inspired by him in decorated meeting halls. He would likely stare silently for several minutes, then ask where the horses were. Now, naturally, 19th century Romantic writers intensified everything. This was the age of Gothic revival, medieval nostalgia, dramatic ruins, and people becoming emotionally overwhelmed by old castles. Europe absolutely fell in love with the Middle Ages again. Selective Middle Ages, of course. Mostly the atmospheric parts, not the dysentery. And the Templars fit perfectly into this romantic vision. They combined tragedy, secrecy, religion, warfare, and sudden destruction. A historian's dream. Or perhaps a novelist's dream even more. Soon novels, paintings, poems, and operas transformed the Templars into doomed heroes crushed by corruption and tyranny, which simplified reality considerably. The real Templars were more morally complicated. But complicated people rarely become legendary as efficiently as tragic martyrs. Now, eventually the 20th century arrived, and things became much stranger, because modern conspiracy culture adopted the Templars enthusiastically. Suddenly they were linked to everything. The Holy Grail,
Ancient bloodlines,
lost treasures, hidden codes, Freemasons, secret governments, alien theories occasionally, because apparently no historical mystery is fully complete until extraterrestrials wander in awkwardly. Books claimed the Templars discovered hidden knowledge beneath Jerusalem, or protected descendants of Jesus, or maintained secret archives capable of transforming history. These theories became wildly popular, especially because the Templars already possessed the perfect ingredients for myth-making. Ancient organization, violent destruction, missing records, financial power, religious symbolism, and ominous-looking castles. Honestly, if you designed a fictional conspiracy group in a laboratory, it would look suspiciously like the Templars. Now, one especially influential modern myth came from books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail. This book proposed elaborate theories connecting the Templars to hidden bloodlines and secret societies. Historians criticized its claims heavily. But criticism rarely stops exciting ideas from spreading, especially ideas involving hidden truths suppressed for centuries. Humans adore the possibility that history contains secret doors. Now, eventually popular culture fully embraced the Templars. Films, video games, television series, adventure novels. Suddenly, every ancient ruin potentially concealed Templar treasure. Every medieval symbol became suspicious. Every underground tunnel apparently connected to hidden nightly vaults. The Templars became less a historical organization and more a giant cultural inkblot onto which people projected fantasies about power and mystery. And through all this, the real medieval men underneath the mythology became strangely obscured. The exhausted knights guarding pilgrims, the administrators tracking grain supplies, the aging veterans defending Acre, the prisoners tortured into confessions. Those quieter human details often disappear beneath the treasure maps and coded manuscripts, which is a little sad, because the actual story is already fascinating enough. An organization born from religious idealism became one of the richest institutions in Europe. Then it was destroyed through a mixture of fear, politics, debt, and opportunism. That alone barely needs embellishment. But humans have never been especially good at leaving mysteries alone, especially mysteries involving missing gold. Now, interestingly, modern historians continue uncovering new information about the Templars through archaeology and archival research. Not hidden mystical revelations. Mostly documents. So many documents. Letters. Financial records. Property disputes. Administrative notes. Because despite all the legends, medieval institutions generated endless paperwork. Even holy warrior monks could not escape bureaucracy. Somewhere in history, a Templar brother absolutely spent an afternoon arguing over grain inventories while dreaming of simpler times. And perhaps that is the strangest contrast of all. The Templars became immortal in legend not because of their daily reality, but because of the gap between reality and imagination. A gap large enough for centuries of stories to drift into. And honestly, humans have been drifting into that gap ever since. They combine tragedy, secrecy, religion, warfare, and sudden destruction. A historian's dream. Or perhaps a novelist's dream even more. Soon novels, paintings, poems, and operas transformed the Templars into doomed heroes crushed by corruption and tyranny, which simplified reality considerably. The real Templars were more morally complicated. But complicated people rarely become legendary as efficiently as tragic martyrs. Now, eventually the 20th century arrived, and things became much stranger, because modern conspiracy culture adopted the Templars enthusiastically. Suddenly they were linked to everything. The Holy Grail,
Ancient bloodlines.
lost treasures, hidden codes, Freemasons, secret governments, alien theories occasionally, because apparently no historical mystery is fully complete until extraterrestrials wander in awkwardly. Books claimed the Templars discovered hidden knowledge beneath Jerusalem, or protected descendants of Jesus, or maintained secret archives capable of transforming history. These theories became wildly popular, especially because the Templars already possessed the perfect ingredients for myth-making. Ancient organization, violent destruction, missing records, financial power, religious symbolism, and ominous-looking castles. Honestly, if you designed a fictional conspiracy group in a laboratory, it would look suspiciously like the Templars. Now, one especially influential modern myth came from books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail. This book proposed elaborate theories connecting the Templars to hidden bloodlines and secret societies. Historians criticized its claims heavily. But criticism rarely stops exciting ideas from spreading, especially ideas involving hidden truths suppressed for centuries. Humans adore the possibility that history contains secret doors. Now, eventually popular culture fully embraced the Templars. Films, video games, television series, adventure novels. Suddenly, every ancient ruin potentially concealed Templar treasure. Every medieval symbol became suspicious. Every underground tunnel apparently connected to hidden nightly vaults. The Templars became less a historical organization and more a giant cultural inkblot onto which people projected fantasies about power and mystery. And through all this, the real medieval men underneath the mythology became strangely obscured. the exhausted knights guarding pilgrims, the administrators tracking grain supplies, the aging veterans defending Acre, the prisoners tortured into confessions. Those quieter human details often disappear beneath the treasure maps and coded manuscripts, which is a little sad, because the actual story is already fascinating enough. An organization born from religious idealism became one of the richest institutions in Europe. Then it was destroyed through a mixture of fear, politics, debt, and opportunism. That alone barely needs embellishment. But humans have never been especially good at leaving mysteries alone, especially mysteries involving missing gold. Now, interestingly, modern historians continue uncovering new information about the Templars through archaeology and archival research. Not hidden mystical revelations. Mostly documents. So many documents. Letters. Financial records. Property disputes. Administrative notes. Because despite all the legends, medieval institutions generated endless paperwork. Even holy warrior monks could not escape bureaucracy. Somewhere in history, a Templar brother absolutely spent an afternoon arguing over grain inventories while dreaming of simpler times. And perhaps that is the strangest contrast of all. The Templars became immortal in legend not because of their daily reality, but because of the gap between reality and imagination. A gap large enough for centuries of stories to drift into. And honestly, humans have been drifting into that gap ever since. So tonight, let's slow things down a little. We've wandered through Crusades, kings, conspiracies, arrests, and treasure legends. But now let's drift away from dramatic politics for a while and spend some time inside the actual daily world of the Knights Templar. Because the strange thing about famous historical organizations is that most of their existence was not dramatic at all. Most days were ordinary, even for warrior monks guarding the Holy Land. Especially for warrior monks guarding the Holy Land. History often compresses entire centuries into battles and scandals. But real people still had to wake up every morning, put on clothes, eat breakfast, maintain equipment, listen to boring speeches, and try not to get sick from questionable water. And the Templars were no exception. So imagine for a moment a Templar commandery somewhere in 12th century France. Perhaps a stone complex surrounded by farmland. A chapel nearby. Stables. Workshops. Storage buildings. A kitchen permanently smelling faintly of onions and smoke. And inside, men moving quietly through routines repeated thousands of times across Europe. Now, first, an important clarification. Not every Templar was a knight. This surprises many people. The order actually contained several ranks and roles. There were knight brothers, who usually came from noble backgrounds and served as heavy cavalry. There were sergeants, who had lower social status and performed military or administrative work. There were chaplains who handled religious duties. And then there were servants, laborers, craftsmen, and local workers attached to Templar properties. It was an enormous institution. Not just dramatic horsemen charging across deserts in slow motion. Although admittedly medieval chroniclers would have preferred the slow-motion version. Now Templar knights themselves were expected to live under strict discipline. Very strict discipline. Their famous rulebook outlined regulations for nearly everything: what they could wear, what they could eat, how they prayed, how they slept, how they spoke, how many horses they could own, even how enthusiastically they were allowed to hunt. Because medieval religious orders absolutely loved detailed lifestyle restrictions. At times, the rule of the Templars reads less like military guidance and more like a deeply concerned parent trying to manage unusually aggressive sons. Now, a Templar's day typically revolved around prayer. This was still a religious order after all. The brothers attended services repeatedly throughout the day and night according to monastic schedules, which sounds spiritually admirable, but also exhausting, especially because medieval devotional routines were relentless. Night prayers, morning prayers, evening prayers, more prayers. Somewhere a sleepy Templar absolutely sat half awake in chapel wondering whether salvation might occasionally permit a short nap. Now, unlike many monks, however, the Templars also trained constantly for warfare. They maintained horses, practiced combat, repaired armor, and prepared equipment. And medieval military equipment required endless maintenance. Chainmail alone must have consumed entire human lifetimes. Imagine patiently repairing thousands of tiny interlocking metal rings while candle smoke drifts through the room and someone nearby is discussing grain taxes. A deeply glamorous existence. Now, horses were especially important. Templars relied heavily on cavalry, and war horses were enormously valuable. A knight might have several horses assigned for different purposes: riding horses, war horses, pack animals, and each required feeding, grooming, medical attention, and supervision. Honestly, medieval warfare often feels less like heroic combat and more like advanced horse management, occasionally interrupted by violence. The Templars became extremely skilled logisticians partly because they had to be. Moving men and horses across long distances required astonishing organization. Food alone posed constant challenges, especially in the Crusader states. Now, meals inside Templar houses were meant to remain relatively simple. Brothers generally ate together in silence, while religious texts were read aloud, which sounds peaceful at first, until you imagine trying to chew stale bread quietly while listening to someone read Latin scripture for the fourth consecutive evening. Templar diets included bread, vegetables, beans, fish, and occasionally meat, though rules about meat consumption varied. Many religious orders restricted meat because apparently medieval spirituality considered flavor deeply suspicious. Pleasure itself often seemed vaguely dangerous. Still, compared to ordinary peasants, the Templars probably ate reasonably well, especially at wealthier commanderies. And wine, naturally, appeared regularly. Because this was medieval Europe. Water quality could be unreliable, and wine was often safer. Entire civilizations functioned partially because fermented beverages existed. Now, one surprisingly difficult aspect of Templar life was obedience. Modern people often underestimate how intensely hierarchical medieval society was. Templars surrendered enormous personal freedom upon joining. Superiors controlled assignments, schedules, movement, clothing, and behavior. A brother could not simply wander off because he felt emotionally overwhelmed by monastery life, which surely happened occasionally. Imagine joining the order full of idealism, then realizing your next several decades involve rigid schedules, military discipline, communal sleeping arrangements, and arguments about mule management. Now sleeping conditions themselves were modest. Templars generally slept in shared dormitories. Privacy barely existed, which honestly sounds emotionally exhausting. No quiet personal room. No retreat from constant communal life. Just rows of beds, snoring brothers, flickering candles, and probably at least one man with catastrophic allergies. And remember, these were armed knights, not naturally contemplative scholars. Many recruits likely came from noble warrior backgrounds where personal pride and independence were highly valued. So the order constantly struggled to maintain discipline. The rule contains repeated warnings against vanity, gambling, swearing, excessive laughter, and luxurious behavior, which strongly suggests those problems occurred constantly. History's strictest rules often reveal exactly what people were already doing. Now, clothing regulations were particularly important. The famous white mantle symbolized purity and elite status within the order. Sergeants wore darker colors. Everything emphasized simplicity and uniformity. Bright decorative fashions were discouraged, because medieval nobles adored extravagant clothing whenever possible. Left unsupervised, aristocrats will absolutely embroider things unnecessarily. The Templars tried to suppress this instinct, not always successfully. Now, despite vows of poverty, individual Templars still handled valuable equipment: armor, weapons, horses, military supplies. And this created an odd contradiction. A Templar personally owned almost nothing, but collectively, the order controlled immense wealth. It was communal institutional power rather than individual luxury, at least in theory. Reality naturally became messier. Some high-ranking Templars lived quite comfortably. Grand Masters negotiated with kings and popes. Senior officials managed huge estates. Administrative power tends to produce nicer furniture eventually. Now in the Holy Land, life could become extremely stressful. Templar castles operated under constant military threat.
Raids,
Sieges,
disease,
supply shortages,
heat,
and the psychological pressure of living permanently on contested frontiers. Many brothers spent years stationed far from home in dangerous conditions. Some died young. Others survived decades of campaigning. And unlike ordinary crusaders who eventually return home, the Templars remained permanently committed. This was their life. Now, interestingly, the Templars also developed surprisingly advanced financial systems. And honestly, medieval banking sounds profoundly exhausting. Imagine managing international transfers using handwritten records, horse messengers, ships, and wax seals while half of Europe remains illiterate and roads are full of thieves. Yet somehow they made it work. Templar commanderies functioned partly as secure storage sites. Nobles deposited valuables there. Pilgrims arranged travel funds. Kings borrowed money. The order's reputation for reliability became one of its greatest strengths. Again, this made rulers nervous eventually. But for ordinary clients, the Templars provided something precious in the medieval world: predictability. Now, not every Templar lived dramatically. Many brothers spent entire careers managing estates in Europe rather than fighting abroad. A Templar in England or France might supervise farming operations, oversee rents, inspect mills, negotiate disputes, and handle accounting. Less holy warfare. More medieval property management, which probably disappointed some young recruits expecting constant adventure. Imagine dreaming of heroic combat in Jerusalem and instead spending 12 years resolving grain storage disagreements near rural Burgundy. History contains enormous amounts of administrative disappointment. Now, illness was another constant reality. Medical knowledge remained limited. Injuries healed poorly. Infections spread easily. And communal living conditions encouraged disease. Aging Templars likely carried scars, chronic pain, damaged joints, and untreated illnesses accumulated over decades. Life expectancy was uncertain. Death was familiar. This shaped medieval psychology profoundly. The Templars prayed constantly, partly because mortality surrounded them constantly. War, disease, accidents, famine, all remained close. And yet, despite hardship, many brothers clearly believed deeply in the Order's mission. That sincerity matters. Modern cynicism sometimes treats all medieval religion as purely political or manipulative. But many Templars genuinely saw themselves as serving God through sacrifice and discipline, even if later generations buried that reality beneath conspiracy theories. Now, one especially interesting aspect of Templar culture was silence. Meals were often silent. Certain conversations were restricted. Behavior was tightly monitored, because medieval monastic life valued control over speech. Words themselves were treated as spiritually dangerous.
Gossip, boasting,
Crude jokes, complaints, all could threaten discipline. Of course, humans remained human. Templars undoubtedly gossiped anyway. One can practically hear whispered late-night conversations drifting through dormitories, complaints about superiors, arguments about supplies, speculation about politics. Some brother definitely snoring like a dying ox. The ordinary frustrations of communal life never disappear, no matter how sacred the institution becomes. Now, punishment inside the order could be severe. Disobedience might result in fasting, public humiliation, loss of privileges, or harsher penalties. Cowardice in battle was especially serious. Remember, the Templars built their reputation partly on steadfastness under pressure. Retreating improperly could disgrace the order. This expectation placed enormous psychological burden on members during combat. Some battles essentially became death sentences. Yet brothers were expected to remain disciplined regardless, which sounds noble in theory and terrifying in practice. Now, despite all these hardships, the order attracted recruits continuously for nearly 2 centuries.
Why?
Well, partly because medieval aristocratic culture glorified knighthood and religious devotion simultaneously. The Templars combined both. Joining offered purpose, prestige, spiritual meaning, adventure, at least potentially. And perhaps for some younger sons of noble families, it also offered structure in a world where inheritance opportunities were limited. Not everyone could inherit castles. Some became monks. Some became mercenaries. And some joined warrior orders to seek salvation while carrying swords. A deeply medieval compromise. Now, strangely, this ordinary daily existence often disappears beneath later mythology. Popular culture remembers secret treasures and hidden rituals. But the real Templars mostly lived structured, repetitive, demanding lives shaped by prayer, administration, discipline, and exhaustion.